Section 34 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 6, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Elisabeth, Chapter 8, Part 6. Elisabeth had been personally interested by the learning, eloquence, and ardent loyalty of the celebrated Edmund Campion, before the possibility was imagined of that star of the University of Oxford forsaking the reformed religion, by law established in England, for the proscribed doctrines of the Church of Rome, after he had been tortured repeatedly for the purpose of extorting from him the particulars of some secret plot against the Queen, in which he was suspected of being an agent. Elisabeth determined to see and confer with Campion herself, and by her orders he was secretly brought one evening from the Tower and introduced to her, at the house of the Earl of Leicester, in the presence of that nobleman, the Earl of Bedford, and the two Secretaries of State. She asked him if he acknowledged her for queen. He replied, "Not only for queen, but for my lawful queen." She demanded, if he considered that the Pope could excommunicate her lawfully. He replied evasively, that it was not for him to decide in a controversy between her Majesty and the Pope. By the Pope's ordinary power he could not excommunicate princes. Whether he could by that power, which he sometimes exercised in extraordinary emergencies, was a difficult and doubtful question. Such an answer was not likely to prove satisfactory to so subtle a princess as Elisabeth, and she left him to the decision of her judges. He and 12 other Catholic priests were arraigned for treason, found guilty, and sentenced to the usual horrible death awarded to traitors. This occurred while the Duke of Anjou was at the court of Elisabeth, and it was observed by some of the members of the council that the execution of so many Catholic priests would disgust the future consort of their sovereign. Burleigh represented the necessity of the execution as a measure of expediency, to allay the apprehensions of the Protestants at that peculiar crisis. Campion, with 2 others, asserted their innocence of any offence against the government, and praying, with their last breath, for Queen Elizabeth. Anjou took the matter as calmly as Gallio, caring for none of those things. His creed was evidently similar to that of the cynical citizen of London in 1788, who sought to preserve his house from the attacks of the No Popery rabble in the riots led by Lord George Gordon, by chalking on his door, "No religion at all." All ranks of her people hailed her rejection of Anjou with enthusiastic feelings of applause. Shakespeare has celebrated her triumph over the snares of love in the following elegant lines: "That very time I saw, but thou couldst not, flying between the cold moon and the earth, Cupid all armed. A certain aim he took at a fair vestal throned by the west, and loosed his love shaft smartly from his bow, as it should pierce 100,000 hearts. But I might see young Cupid's fiery shaft quenched in the chaste beams of the watery moon, and the imperial votress passed on in maiden meditation fancy free." So much, however, had Anjou contrived to endear himself to the fair vestal, that the news of his danger in his last illness gave her such pain that she refused to believe it, accused her ambassador, Sir Edward Stafford, of wishing for his death, and reprimanded him in such severe terms that when that event actually occurred he was afraid of informing her, for fear, as he said, of ministering cause to her grief. Henry III, in a letter to Mauvissiere, his ambassador, directs him to communicate this event to the Queen of England, his good sister, who, I am sure, says he, will share in my great regret, for he greatly honoured her. So ended the last matrimonial negotiation in which Elizabeth condescended to engage. From that time on, she appears to have regarded herself entirely as the spouse of the nation. "The Queen," says Sir John Harrington, "did once ask my wife, in merry sort, how she kept my good will and love? My Moll, in wise and discreet manner, told her highness, she had confidence in her husband's understanding and courage, well founded on her own steadfastness, not to offend or thwart, but to cherish and obey. Hereby did she persuade her husband of her own affection, and in so doing did command his." Go to, mistress," saith the queen. You are wisely bent, I find. After such sort do I keep the goodwill of all my husbands, my good people, for if they did not rest assured in some special love towards them, they would not readily yield me such good obedience. In the same year, 1583, the Tsar, Ivan Basilovich, applied to Elisabeth to negotiate a peace between him and John, King of Sweden, and was so well pleased with her good offices that, imagining she might stand his friend in a matter more interesting to his personal happiness, he made humble suit to her majesty to send him a wife out of England. Elisabeth made choice of a young lady of royal Plantagenet descent, and sister of the Earl of Huntingdon. But when she discovered that the barbarous laws of Muscovy allowed the sovereign to put away his Tsarina as soon as he was tired of her, and wished for something new in the conjugal department, she excused her fair subject from accepting the proffered honour, by causing his imperial majesty to be informed that the young lady's health was too delicate for such a change of climate, and her mother was too tenderly attached to endure the absence of her daughter, and above all, the laws of England would not permit her to give away the daughters of her subjects in marriage without the consent of her parents. The Tsar was dissatisfied and did not long survive his disappointment. Some years after, one of his successors, the Tsar Boris Godunov, made a request to her to send an English consort for one of his sons, and by the following passages in a letter from his imperial majesty to her, it should seem that Elisabeth had either outlived her former scruples, or found some noble family willing to obtain the perilous preferment for one of the daughters, and that the royal Muscovite entertained a suspicion that some trickery was intended in the matter, for he manifests prudential caution in his inquiries as to the young lady's descent, person, and qualifications. Concerning the argument of your princely letters, he says, it cannot but give us an extraordinary contentment, we finding therein your majesty's love and affection towards us and our children, carefully endeavouring the matching and bestowing of them in your own line and race. By which your letters your highness made known unto us, that, amongst others, you have made choice of a young lady, being a pure maiden, nobly descended by her father and mother, adorned with graces and extraordinary gifts of nature, about 11 years of age, of whom you made an offer to us. But your majesty hath not particularly written unto us of this worthy lady, what she is, whether she be of your highness's blood, descended of your royal race, by your father or mother, or from some other archduke or duke, whereof we are desirous of being resolved. This year died Elisabeth's faithful kinsman and servant, the Earl of Sussex. He retained his contempt of his old adversary, Leicester, to the last. I am now passing into another world, said he to the friends who surrounded his death-bed, and I must leave you to your fortunes and the Queen's grace and goodness, but beware of the gypsy, or he will be too hard for you all. You know not the nature of the beast as well as I do. Leicester, however, never regained his influence with his royal mistress after his marriage with her cousin, Lettice Knollys, the widow of the Earl of Essex, though he retained his position in the cabinet, and was, with Burleigh and Hatton, mainly instrumental in traversing her marriage with the Duke of Anjou. Elisabeth's temper became more irritable than usual after she was deprived of the amusement of coquetting with the princes and envoys of France over her last matrimonial treaty, and Burleigh often shed bitter tears in private in consequence of the life she led him. At length, worn out with these vexations, and disgusted with the treatment he received from a growing party that was beginning to divide the council against him, he requested permission to withdraw from the turmoils of the court and end his days in retirement at Theobalds, on which the queen, who knew his value too well to be content to part with him, wrote the following lively letter to the discontented minister. Sir Spirit, I doubt I do nickname you, for those of your kind, they say, have no sense, or feeling. But I have lately seen an ecce signum, that if an ass kick you, you feel it too soon. I will recant you from being spirit, if ever I perceive that you disdain not such a feeling. Serve God, fear the king, and be a good fellow to the rest. Let never care appear in you for such a rumour, but let them well know that you desire the righting of such wrong, by making known their error, than you to be so silly a soul as to forslow what you ought to do, or not freely deliver what you think meetest, and pass no man so much as not to regard her trust who putteth it in you. God bless you, and long may you last. Omnino E.R. The queen likewise wrote a facetious address to him, by the title of Sir Eremite of Tibble or Theobalds, a rhapsody, which in affection surpasses all the euphemism of that era. Elisabeth loved now and then quietly to circumvent Burleigh. On one of her visits to Theobalds, she had promised to make 7 knights. He chose and arranged the candidates for that honour, so that some gentlemen of ancient lineage stood at the lower part of his hall, meaning that the parvenus should be knighted first as the queen passed, and thus as the elder knights take precedence ever after of their better born neighbours. The queen was informed of this scheme, but said nothing. As she went through the hall, where the candidates for knighthood were placed, according to Burleigh's policy, she passed by all till she came to the screen, when she turned about and said, "I had almost forgot what I had promised," and beginning with the lowest placed gentleman, knighted all in rotation as they stood. Stanhope, a gentleman of her privy chamber, observed to her, "Your majesty is too fine for my lord Burleigh." "Nay," replied Elisabeth, "I have but fulfilled the scripture, the first shall be last, and the last first." Elisabeth's ladies and courtiers were universally malcontent at the idea of a visit to Theobalds, where strict economy and precision of manners always prevailed, and no amusements were provided for their recreation. Elisabeth's maids of honour were regarded with a jealous eye by her cabinet as the purveyors of the abundant stores of gossip with which her majesty was constantly supplied. Yet they had little influence in obtaining her favour for any applicant, which made Sir Walter Raleigh declare that they were like witches, capable of doing great harm, but no good. Sir Fulk Greville, who had often access to the queen, held long private conversations with her, and though he had both the power and inclination to do good, which he often used for the benefit of those who had fallen into disgrace, the queen's maids declared, "he brought her all the tales she heard," which made him say merrily of himself, that he was like Robin Goodfellow, for when the dairy maids upset the milk pans, or made a romping and racket, they laid it all on Robin. So whatever gossip tale the queen's ladies told her, or whatever bad turns they did to the courtiers, they laid it all upon him. Indeed, there seems to have been an incipient warfare for ever going on between Elisabeth's maids of honour and the gentlemen of her household. Her kinsman, Sir Francis Knollys, a learned old militaire, whose office brought his apartment in close contiguity to the dormitory of the maids of honour, declared, that they used, when retired for the night, to frisk and hay about, so that it was in vain for him to attempt sleep or study. One night, when the fair bevy were more than usually obstreperous, he marched into their apartment in dishabille, and with his book in his hand, and an enormous pair of spectacles on his nose, walked up and down declaiming in Latin. Some of the young ladies fled, half dressed, others entreated his absence, but he said, he would not leave them in quiet possession of their dormitory without their permitting him to rest in his apartment. But these lively ladies, like the rest of Elisabeth's household, sometimes felt, in their turn, the effects of her caprice. "I could relate," says Harrington, "many pleasant tales of her majesty's outwitting the wittiest ones, for few knew how to aim their shafts against her cunning. I will tell a story that fell out when I was a boy. She did love rich clothing, but often chid those that bought more finery than became their state. It happened that Lady Mary Howard was possessed of a rich border, powdered with gold and pearls, and a velvet suit belonging thereto, which moved many to envy, nor did it please the queen, who thought it exceeded her own. One day the queen did send privately, and got the lady's rich vesture, which she put on herself, and came forth to chamber among her ladies, the kirtle and border being far too short for her majesty's height. She asked every one, how they liked her new fancied suit? At length She asked the owner herself, if it were not made too short and ill becoming? To which the poor lady agreed. Why then, rejoined the queen, if it become not me, as being too short, it shall never become thee, as being too fine. This sharp rebuke abashed the lady, and the vestment was laid up till after the queen's death. As a proof that Elizabeth possessed the rare faculty of dividing her attention among a variety of subjects at the same time, Harrington records the fact that she wrote one letter while she dictated another to her amanuensis, and listened to a tale, to which she made suitable replies, all at the same time. He has preserved the letters, which were found in a manuscript entitled "A Precious Token of Her Highness's Great Wit and Marvellous Understanding." In one of these letters, Queen Elizabeth defines friendship to be the uniform consent of two minds, such as virtue links, and naught but death can part. Therefore, says the royal metaphysician, I conclude the house which shrinketh from its foundation shall down for me. With consummate knowledge of the human heart, she goes on to observe, that where minds differ, and opinions swerve, there is scant a friend in that company. Queen Elizabeth gave her half-brother, Sir John Perrot, the command of a fleet to intercept a meditated invasion of Ireland by Philip II, and Sir John prepared for the voyage, taking with him for his personal band 50 gentlemen of good family, dressed in orange-coloured cloaks. As this party lay to, in his barge off Greenwich Palace, where the queen kept her court, Sir John sent one of these orange men on shore with a diamond, as a token to his mistress, Blanche Parry, willing him to tell her, that a diamond coming unlooked for did always bring good luck with it. Which the queen overhearing, sent Sir John a fair jewel hanged by a white cypress, a white love ribbon, signifying withal, that as long as he wore that for her sake, she did believe, with God's help, he should have no harm. This message and jewel Sir John received right joyfully, and returned answer to the queen, that he would wear it for his sovereign's sake, and he doubted not, with God's favour, to restore her ships in safety, and either to bring back the Spaniards prisoners if they came his way, or to sink them in the deep seas. So as Sir John passed in his barge, the queen, looking out of a window at Greenwich Palace, shaked her fan at him, and brought out her hand towards him. Whereupon he, making a low obeisance, put the scarf and jewel round his neck. Sir John encountered no enemy but a dreadful storm. Perrot was soon after appointed by the queen to the highest military command in Ireland, where, while he exercised the most despotic cruelty on the insurgents, he manifested the strongest inclination to act independently of her majesty, whose birth he considered not a whit better than his own. The speeches he made on various occasions to this effect were carefully registered against him. It was his pleasure to suppress the cathedral of St. Patrick. The queen forbade this proceeding, when he thus undutifully addressed the council. Stick not so much on the queen's letters of commandment, for she may command what she will, but we will do what we like. The queen appointed Mr. Errington clerk of the exchequer, on which Sir John exclaimed, "This fiddling woman troubles me out of measure. God's dear lady, he shall not have the office. I will give it to Sir Thomas Williams." This was proved by the oath of his secretary, Philip Williams, who, when he was brought to trial for disobedience and contempt of the queen, was the principal witness against him. Sir John earnestly requested his secretary might be confronted with him. But with the infamous injustice with which such trials were carried on in the 16th century, Popham, the queen's attorney general, forbade this reasonable request. One of the depositions of this man touched Elizabeth on tender ground. At the time of the Spanish invasion, Sir John, by his reports, said, "Ah, silly woman, now she shall not curb me, now she shall not rule me. Now, God's dear lady, I shall be her white boy again." Adding, that when Sir John Garland brought him letter from the queen, he said, with violent execrations, "This it is, to serve a base-born woman. Had I served any prince in Christendom, I had not been thus dealt withal." He was accused of treasonable communication with Spain, but nothing was proved excepting foolish speeches. He attributed his disgrace chiefly to the malice of his old enemy, Sir Christopher Hatton, whom he despised as a carpet knight, who had danced his way into Elizabeth's good graces. When Sir John Perrot was told he must die, he exclaimed, "God's death! Will my sister sacrifice her brother to his frisking adversaries?" When Elizabeth heard this truly Tudor-like remonstrance, she paused from signing his death warrant, saying, "They were all knaves that condemned him." His furious antipathy to Sir Christopher Hatton, and his sneers at his dancing, will remind the reader of Gray's celebrated lines: "My lord high keeper led the brawls, the seals and maces danced before him." Sir John Perrot was not executed, but pined himself to death, like a prisoned eagle, in confinement in the Tower. The greatest contradiction ever offered to Queen Elizabeth proceeded from her men of her own blood. One afternoon, when she was at cards, she turned to her young kinsman, Robert Carey, who stood at her elbow, and asked him when his father, Lord Hunsdon, meant to depart to his government at Berwick. He replied, "After Whitsuntide." This information put her majesty into a great rage. "God's wounds!" she exclaimed, "I will set him by the feet, and send another in his place, if he dallies thus." Robert Carey replied that the delay was but to make provision. She declared that Hunsdon had been going from Christmas to Easter, and from Easter to Whitsuntide, and if he was not off directly, she would put another in his place, and so she commanded Carey to tell him. But Hunsdon came of her own lineage, and shared her own indomitable spirit. By way of reply, he told his mind very freely to Burleigh. The threat of laying him by the feet he could not digest, and alluded to it in these high-spirited words: "Any imprisonment she may put me to shall redound to her dishonour, because I neither have nor will I deserve it." The queen's conduct to this faithful kinsman is characteristic of her niggardliness. He had a double claim on the earldom of Wiltshire. Elizabeth withheld it through his life, but when he was on his deathbed, she sent the robes and patent to his bedside. Whereupon he, who could dissemble neither in life nor death, sent them back with these words: "Tell the queen, that if I was unworthy these honours living, I am unworthy of them dying." It will be allowed that a narrative, wholly devoted to the personal biography of Elizabeth, can afford but a few words as a retrospect of her regal sway over the sister island. "Ireland," says Naughton, "cost her more vexation than anything else. The expense of it pinched her, the ill success of her offices wearied her, and in that service she grew hard to please. The barbarity with which she caused that country to be devastated is unprecedented, excepting in the extermination of the Caribs by the Spaniards." Henry VIII had given himself little concern with the state of religion in Ireland. It remained virtually a Catholic country. The monasteries and their inhabitants were not uprooted, as in England, and the whole country incipiently acknowledged the supremacy of the Pope, through all the Tudor reigns, till Elizabeth ascended the throne. The false step taken by the Pope at Elizabeth's accession, by mooting the point of her reign de jure, instead of considering it de facto, forced her into the measure of insisting that all Ireland should renounce the Catholic religion and become Protestant, and this she enforced under the severest penal laws. Ireland, which had acknowledged the English monarchs as suzerains, or lords paramount over their petty kings and chiefs, for several centuries, had scarcely allowed them as kings of Ireland for a score of years, now flamed out into rebellion against the English Lord Deputy, and this functionary, by the Queen's orders, governed despotically by mere orders of council, and endeavoured to dispense with the Irish Parliament. The taxes were forthwith cessed at the will of the Lord Deputy. The Earl of Desmond, the head of the Fitzgeralds, and possessed at that time of an estate of 600,000 acres, aided by Lord Baltinglass, head of the Eustaces, whose family had for 4 generations filled the office of Lord's Treasurer or Lord's Deputy, and were ever closely allied with the Geraldines, resisted the payment of this illegal tax, and required that a parliament might be called, as usual, to fix the demands on the subject, for which measure these gallant precursors of Hampden were forthwith immured in a tower of Dublin Castle. They sent messengers to Elizabeth to complain of the conduct of her lord deputy; for which presumption, as she called it, she transferred them to the more alarming prison of the Tower of London. The English Parliament, however, finding their sole crime was the vindication of the existence of a Parliament in Ireland, were inclined to view the case as bearing on their own. Elizabeth, therefore, postponed her vengeance on Desmond and Baltinglass, and ordered their liberation. Philip of Spain then, in revenge for the assistance given by Elizabeth to his Protestant subjects in the Low Countries, proffered aid to the Irish. The Geraldines and Eustaces flew to arms, and for many years sustained a contest with the English Lord Deputy. At length the venerable Earl of Desmond, crushed by overwhelming numbers, became a fugitive, and after wandering about in glens and forests for 3 years, was surprised in a lonely hut by a party of his enemies. Kelly of Moriarty struck off his head, and conveyed it, as an acceptable present, to Queen Elizabeth, by whose order it was fixed on London Bridge. The Lord Deputy Montjoy, the Irish say by the advice of Spenser, the poet, the commander of the English forces, commenced that horrid war of extermination which the natives call the Hags' Wars. The houses and standing corn of the wretched natives were burnt, and the cattle killed, wherever the English came, which starved the people into temporary submission. When some of the horrors of the case were represented to the queen, and she found the state to which the sister island was reduced, she was heard to exclaim, that she found she had sent wolves, not shepherds, to govern Ireland, for they had left nothing but ashes and carcasses for her to reign over. This deprecatory speech did not, however, save the lives of the patriots who had resisted the extinction of the Irish parliaments. Lord Baltinglass was beheaded, and a peculiar act passed, called the Statute of Baltinglass, which confiscated the estates granted to the Eustaces in Ireland, although the younger brother of Lord Baltinglass had taken no part in the rebellion. The latter days of Elizabeth were certainly impoverished and embittered by the long strife in Ireland, and if her sister declared that when dead Calais had been found written on her heart, Elizabeth had as much reason to affirm that the burning cares connected with the state of Ireland had wasted her lamp of life. End of Section 34. End of The Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 6, by Agnes and Elizabeth Strickland.